Thanks, Chair. Thank you all for coming in today. It can be a bruising encounter sometimes. And Mr. Fielding, thank you very much. I had to leave to speak in the chamber, but I read through your presentation, so thank you. Mr. Sheridan, can I ask you for your view on whether or not the right legislation and the right tools and capacity are in place? As I looked through this, there was a McKinsey study from the 90s that looked at European banking, and it concluded that Irish banks were the most profitable in Europe. I can't remember if it was in the world, but certainly they were the most profitable in Europe. Mr. Fielding, in his remarks, has cited a report from October 2004 by the Wall Street financiers that showed that Irish banks were making 3 times the profit of other European banks. They were again, the most profitable banks in Europe. We have a European Commission report from 1997 which concluded that there was cartel activity operating in the Irish banks. And we obviously have a very long and regrettable history of Irish banks and how they've acted over the last many decades in this country. So, various reports from multiple sources, all credible sources, suggest that Irish banks make more money from Irish citizens and from Irish businesses than other banks in comparable countries, and that has been going on for a very long time. It was going on in the mid-90s. According to the European Commission, it was going on in the late 90s. According to the Wall Street financiers, it was going on in the 2000s. So, it seems to me that some of the comments you made, Ms. Fielding, in your opening remarks around your job is to find the right balance, and I appreciate you have to find that. And another phrase you used was the charges should be reasonable and appropriate. But it seems to me, if you compare what Irish consumers, citizens and businesses are being charged relative to other consumer citizens and businesses in other countries, they're not reasonable and appropriate. So one of 2 things would seem to be wrong. Either the legislation is insufficient and you and your teams and the regulator and the governor do not have sufficient authority from us in the Oireachtas to achieve real competitiveness as benchmarked against other countries. Either you don't have the right tools from us in the Oireachtas, or you do have the right tools and you're not using them properly, because something is wrong. If Irish citizens, consumers and businesses are consistently, over at least 2 decades, I've just gone back 2 decades, being charged several times more than the European average, could I get your view as to whether or not you think you have the tools required, the legislative tools, the capacity within the bank, and if you do, why are we seeing this consistent trend over several decades?
You're probably aware, but there's only one other country in the world that we're aware of actually has a similar framework to ourselves in terms of controlling bank charges. It doesn't exist across Europe. So that's one thing to bear in mind. It's an additional thing that we have that most other countries don't have. Is it good? Is it bad? That depends from where you're standing.
Well, that's what I'd like your view on. That's my question.
Yes. So just to go on, there was a European Commission study done. I know you referenced a number of studies, but in 2009, looking specifically at bank charges rather than bank profitability, and Ireland ranked mid-table in that. So that kind of is an indicator, and I know that's going back to 2009, and maybe that should be revisited again. But it's a fair point as to how do we determine whether it's reasonable or not. So we have, in 2011, we looked at the charges imposed in the UK, both in Northern Ireland and in England. And what we found was that's a different model, but in terms of the out-of-order charges, we're significantly lower here than actually in the UK. In terms of transaction charges, we're broadly in line, but a number of banks in the UK still offer transaction fee-free banking as such. But behind that, they have all these additional charges should you go out of line. So on that basis, we think, yes, it's reasonable enough. But I think we're fully conscious of the fact that the state of the economy, the impact it's having on customers at this particular time is obviously pretty severe. Any kind of increase is not welcomed. So on that basis, I would say In terms of the legislative framework, as I said, it has been looked at. It's there. I think it's useful. It's there now, considering the market is so concentrated. I think that, if in the absence of real competition, it's probably needed. If competition improves, I don't see what role it would play. But how far away are we from real competition being in the market? We're probably some time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I guess if I could just restate the question. The question is, there is pretty unambiguous evidence that Irish customers are being overcharged, be it through interest rates or charges. It's the only way the banks can be more profitable here than they can be anywhere else. So, if we accept that Irish customers are being overcharged, there's got to be a reason for that. Now, either the regulatory environment is not, the regulatory capacity is not good enough, or the legislation is not good enough. But one of those two, something must be going wrong if we're being charged 3 times more than the European average. Can you tell me what you think? Well, let me ask you, sorry, let me broaden the question. Do you accept we're being charged consistently over the last number of decades, several times the European average? And if so, why is that happening?
No, I said based on the information that we have, no, and I don't accept that consumers are being overcharged. We have been performing this role since 2003, and prior to that it was the Director of Consumer Affairs. We have the charges we have. They're set out, as indicated earlier, you're talking about 100 to 200 euro per annum, depending on how you use the account. In my view, I'm not saying that's overcharging, that's charging. Have banks been charging appropriately in terms of the service that they're providing? I think that's a different issue, and what's happening now. And you're right, in terms of how are the banks going to recover, it's very limited, the avenues open to them. One is on the net interest margin, which is not subject to Section 149, and that is obviously a much bigger issue, a much bigger impact on their balance sheets than consumer charges.
So just to be clear, you don't accept that Irish consumers are charged more, either through interest or through charges, because to the consumer it's all the same thing, it's all cash going out of their account. You don't think we're being charged more than other European countries, is that what you're saying?
As I said, based on the information that we have and that we use, no, I don't accept that Irish consumers are being overcharged in relation to bank charges and fees. In terms of interest rates, obviously depends on what product you're talking about.
Okay. Do you accept that the Irish banks per consumer have been consistently more profitable than the European average?
But as I said, profitability is not, there's many more issues associated with the profitability other than the bank charges. Yeah. So I wouldn't like to link the two, that it's because of bank charges that banks have made these profits in the past. Okay,
well, if we could just okay, but let's establish. Thank you.
Just for 2 minutes, because we're being Deputy Leader. I can bring you back in again, okay? But I just want to manage
Thanks,
the
Chair.
allocation.
But do you accept, regardless of where you think those profits are coming from, do you accept that the data shows that Irish banks are more profitable than the European average per customer?
I don't have the information in front of me, but it would not surprise me that there was a period of time where the banks looked to be more profitable than most of the European jurisdictions, but the problem has been they weren't sustainable profits.
And do you have comparative analysis against other developed country jurisdictions on charges other than Northern Ireland?
Northern Ireland and the UK, and we have participated in other kind of conferences in terms of the discussion around should other countries introduce bank charges. So we've been involved internationally on it, but essentially the study has revolved around the UK.
Okay. Look, I know you have a tough job, but with respect, and I think Deputy Donnelly was saying something similar, in your role and coming in here today, it's not satisfactory to me that you can only do a comparison to UK banking charges. There is compelling evidence that Irish consumers and Irish businesses have paid more profits to the banks, made our banks more profitable than any others. And I really do think that in your role that you should have solid comparative evidence to see how we stack up versus the US, versus the rest of the developed world.
Thanks, Chair.
I have to say, the more I learn about this, the more I'm concluding that we in the Oireachtas have not given you the right tools. I think this is very important. We've got a situation where banks can increase charges based on 1996 legislation. All they have to do is, beg your pardon, all they've got to do is tell you about it.
They don't even have to.
And we've got an unusual situation now whereby an awful lot of customers can't move. So the market doesn't work at the moment. People are stuck in negative equity, they can't move because they're on a tracker. There's all sorts of reasons now that are new why people can't move. So distressed borrowers and distressed businesses are stuck to banks that they can't get away from. That in a healthy banking market, they just move. They take their business elsewhere. They can't. And these same banks are able to unilaterally increase charges. And we know, and you know, we all know, that it's putting businesses out of operation and that it's causing huge distress. I have to say, I would be in favour of taking a look at the legislation to make sure that you and your team, Mr. Sheridan, do have the tools you need. I'm not convinced that we've given you the tools that you need. One quick reflection, and I have a quick question on the Code of Conduct and Mortgage Arrears. In establishing whether or not the charge structure and the charging environment is reasonable and appropriate, and obviously there's no right answer to that, it's a judgment call, it would be incredibly useful to know where we stand relative to the rest of the OECD. And if we are in the bottom quarter in terms of charges to businesses and citizens, great, reasonable and appropriate. If we're in the top 10–15% along with the UK, to me that's not reasonably appropriate. So I wonder if it would be possible. I'd be astounded if this sort of comparative analysis hasn't already been done. If it might be possible to ask one of your team to send us something on to see. I would be much more comforted in your judgment call if I could see that we are at least at mid-level in the OECD on this, if that would be possible. On the Code of Conduct and Mortgage Arrears, obviously this is a huge issue, and the proposed changes, to me, I'm very, very concerned about the proposed changes. Are you involved in that process?
Oh yeah, yes, I'm leading that, yeah.
Okay, oh, great. Now I know you didn't come here to talk about it, so I don't want to kind of look like I'm trying to ambush you on it at all. The question I'm going to ask you is linked to charges specifically. I have put in a submission. I'm deeply concerned about what the proposed changes are going to do to citizens in this country, but I guess that's for another day. Specifically, I think the Central Bank acted correctly and admirably when, I think in 2010, it instructed the banks not to charge surcharges on those mortgages that were in arrears once those borrowers were under the protection of the Code of Conduct and Mortgage Arrears. I think it was very welcome. It was a great move. Now, the proposed revisions open up numerous new avenues for banks to get borrowers away from the protections of the CCMA. Once they designate a borrower as non-cooperating, the borrower no longer has the protection of the CCMA, and the proposed changes open up numerous ways in which the banks can do that which they couldn't do in the past. Are you concerned that the 2010 instruction, the admirable instruction from the bank, not to just keep ratcheting up charges on distressed borrowers in arrears, are you concerned now that that's going to continue to happen again because the revised proposals really do make it much easier for banks to get borrowers out of the process, away from the protections, and therefore enables them to start stacking up the charges again?
No, it's clearly in the consultation process at the moment, and all submissions will be fully considered. There's no doubt in terms of the cooperating, non-cooperating, we are looking at that to try and make it clearer for both the lenders and the borrowers, actually, are they being treated one way or the other. So we're trying to protect the uncooperating before they become actually too far gone, in the sense of they need to be notified in advance that they're going to be deemed as uncooperating, what they should do to be deemed cooperating, and the implications of such. So I think you're right. I think there's a potential for actually uncooperating, maybe those who are not strategically uncooperating, to be potentially affected by this. We need to look at that very carefully to make sure that doesn't happen. So basically what I'm saying is we will consider what you've said.
Here's the problem. The revised proposals allow the banks to determine whether or not you're cooperating or non-cooperating. And if you want to appeal that, you get to appeal it to the bank. As far as I'm aware, there is no appeal for a consumer, for a citizen, to the central bank. So I, as a bank, and let's assume that the banks have not necessarily acted in the interest of the country in the last while, and some of them at least may continue to act in that way. I, as a bank, can decide you haven't replied to me in a time frame that I, the bank, deem to be appropriate. Therefore, you're now uncooperating. If you want to appeal that, you can appeal it to me. Guess what the answer is going to be? Oh, by the way, now that I've decided you're not responding to my timescales in a way that I deem appropriate, with no oversight from the central bank, no independent appeal, I'm classifying you as non-cooperating. I, the bank, am removing your statutory provisions given to you by the Oireachtas and by the central bank. And now I'm going to start hitting you with lots and lots of charges on your arrears. Can you see that under the new proposals that's much easier for the banks to do? And some of them, at least, based on our interactions with them in here, are going to do whatever they can to get more and more money in.
The concept of cooperating, non-cooperating it's already in the code. I think what we're trying to do is bring greater clarity to it from both perspectives. But we'll take on board what you're saying.
Thank you, Chair.